short stories, theater. I'm sometimes a film director, so I have kind of been privileged to kind of just do what I feel like doing and taking on many art forms. And my latest book is this one here. It's on time and water, or it's called in German Wasser und Zeit. And this book, so in my books, I have kind of been writing both in fantasy and poetry, but in this book, I'm really dealing with the biggest issue of our times, that is sometimes called global warming. But the idea is that the issue is so big that it's larger than language, that it's actually impossible to write about it because it's so big. And the idea is that the words that we've been using, the approaches that we've used, have not cut through, because we can take an example. It seems that we understand the pandemic. So for the corona crisis, first people did not understand it, but then people became sick and started to die, and therefore we took all sorts of measures. So for the corona crisis, we don't go to school, we don't go out, we don't go to theater, we don't travel, we don't hug grandmothers, we don't shake hands. There are all sorts of extreme. It's like living in an absurd, living under an absurd dictator. You know, what dictator tells you not to hug grandmother? It's a terrible regime, and I've been restricted, and everybody's been restricted in a very extreme way. Now we have an issue called global warming. What restrictions have we had for global warming? Have I done anything? Has global warming, or the science of global warming, prevented me from doing anything that I would have wanted to do? I can't recall anything. Have I been asked not to hug my grandmother because of global warming? Have I been asked not to go to theater? Have I been asked to sit in my room for 2 weeks in quarantine because of global warming? No. But if global warming was a real issue, we would feel that maybe there were 10% less cars in the streets. There would be some explanations why I have to go only 2 days to London. There would be some sort of there would be some maybe price on meat. There would be some price on CO2. There would be the military would be putting a cap on chimneys to capture the CO2 and pump that into the ground, or keep it somewhere, store it in a big balloon or something until we have found a way to, or some things would be banned, or some things would be removed, or some things would be scaled up. But there is actually nothing that we can feel. So the only restriction that we have, or the only thing that you can feel, is that now there's a Tesla on the street, which is a better car than any car that I've ever had. So instead of telling us 20 years ago, okay, now there's a crummy electric car that has emerged, and now everybody drives this horrible vehicle that can go 30 kilometers, and then we would patiently wait until that vehicle becomes technically better. No, we don't want any discomfort. So we're not going to take the electric car until it drives 400 kilometers, goes faster than the Mercedes-Benz, and is cooler. So that's the discomfort that our generation has had to tolerate, which is no discomfort. It's just the belief that the biggest crisis on Earth can be comfortably kind of transitioned into a better lifestyle without being troubled at all. But I think I'm not saying that we should have 2 weeks of quarantine. I'm not saying that we should, but you would think that you would have felt it some way in your daily life that we were cooking the planet. So the only discomfort is not in regulations or lifestyle, it is in running away from a forest fire, or yeah. So it's basically a reaction to the yeah, or the floods like you have had in Germany. So the only discomfort is the real discomfort of consequences of not taking action 20 or 30 years ago. So the idea, back to the book, is that we don't really, it seems like we haven't really understood. So when a scientist says 2050, 2100, we don't feel any connection. We don't feel responsible for that date. So that's why my book is about time. So how do you connect deeply to 2100 without going into dystopia or sci-fi, just intimately as a life of somebody I love in 2100? And how do you understand new words like ocean acidification? So like nobody my age learned about this in school. So ocean acidification is the biggest word in the world, and it's out there, but it takes decades for a word to be loaded with meaning. So ocean acidification is about the biggest chemical change of the world oceans in 50 million years. So the drop of the world oceans from 8.1 in pH to 7.7. And that can totally disrupt all marine life on the planet. But of course, nobody really knows. And of course, nobody really wants to know. That is, so the word ocean acidification, if that goes on, and eventually it will disrupt all marine life, then that word will be so loaded with grief and regret that people in 2100 that will read this word and they will see that we knew this word, they will be like, how did you not understand this word? So the book is also about words. That is, how long does it take to understand words? And I go into history of how we did not understand the word democracy in 1809 when it was introduced to Icelanders for the first time. And so we were given democracy in the year 1809, but we just didn't understand the concept, so we didn't receive it. And so it wasn't like we naturally wanted democracy. We had to be told for 100 years that we wanted democracy until people believed the word and understood it, and until the normal people could talk about democracy. Now it's so. I met a scientist, and he told me, "Why don't you write about global warming?" And I said, "Well, I think that's up to scientists. I don't feel like I should intrude into your field." But the same way, where would democracy be if only political scientists and lawyers spoke about democracy? If it was only for the people with PhDs to talk about democracy, if it wasn't people on the streets like democracy. So there would never be a paradigm shift. If feminism, if a normal woman wouldn't be able to talk about her rights, if it was up to a political theorist in feminist conceptual theory, something in the university, there would be no women's rights. So global warming isn't a thing until everybody understands it, and that was what I thought was my civil duty as a writer here and now, to take my part in making this discussion something that normal people can relate to and understand.
Yeah, exactly. We and our friends at home, we often discussed this topic, and then we said, how can we look into our children's eyes later in 20 years when they say, hey, you knew it and you didn't do anything. So I think that's the point, and we just have to start somehow, and not a few of us, all of us, or a huge majority. So we met first in 2014. You just started with the research about the book, and you told me that you found the slides of your grandparents, which are a big part in the book.
Yeah.
What was the trickiest part that made this period so long for you to develop the content of the book? What was the most difficultest thing?
So the book kind of, or the concept, it actually, the first idea was maybe it might be a documentary film.
Yeah,
because
I remember, yeah.
because it started with an interview with the Dalai Lama. So I got a phone call and I was asked to interview him, and I was like, "What can you ask a person that has reincarnated 14 times?" So I started to look for connections, and at that time I was kind of had in my mind I had to do something about my grandparents' journeys on the glaciers because they were glacial researchers, and it didn't really fit that idea to interview the Dalai Lama, but of course you don't say no if somebody asks you to interview the Dalai Lama. And I took it very seriously because, like a normal journalist, he has a job and he doesn't have time to, he just has to do all his work and then he interviews the Dalai Lama. But I had like 6 or 9 months to prepare, which is, so I was very obsessed with reading all the material and
So
browsing and thinking.
Was it when he was here or
Yeah.
when you went there?
No, it was when he came here.
Yeah.
First I thought it was a phone, and that was in the year 2008 when I was asked. But at that time, actually, I had kind of a activist burnout. It's activism is very is a delicate thing. So we had been fighting for the highlands of Iceland, and it was a very intense fight for preserving landscapes and rivers and waterfalls and valleys. And I had written my book Dreamland, so it's kind of as a result of that, I was asked to interview the Dalai Lama. But I had been like doing Dreamland since 2002 to 2009 or 2008, so that had been like a 6-year period of activism, and I had a total activist burnout of being sleepless and mobilizing and being angry and trying to push the machines out of the highlands. And when I started to think about global warming, I was like, no, this isn't possible. You know, I can't. If I'm so obsessed by the highlands of Iceland that I'm kind of just, how can I be worried about the oceans and the glaciers and the atmosphere and every life on the planet? That's it's not a good idea. But and I had some ideas that I had to finish first. So I had a children's book that I had been wanting to make, but Dreamland pushed aside. So I really that book just had to come out, and I couldn't just do Dreamland activism and then global warming activism because my mind doesn't work that way. My brain is more like a field that needs crop rotation. It needs pumpkins 1 year, and then you can plant barley, and then you can have cows eating in the field and tramping everything down, and then it can be wild for a year, and then you can put pumpkins again. So I wasn't just ready to just harvest activism and just harvest more activism. There was no fertile ground for that. So I did a children's book, but all the time I was doing that, I was lecturing. I was meeting lots of foreign students that were coming to Iceland. So I was talking to them about glaciers. I was talking to them about this Tibet-Iceland connection of the sacred cow being made of ice. That made sense as a metaphor for a glacier that is a source of life, as a frozen cow, which is the in Nordic mythology. It makes total sense of the frozen glaciers in the Himalayas that are feeding 1 billion people. So I was talking about all these issues: my grandmother, time, global warming, 2 students, and in that I developed kind of the arts of the book. So the arts came kind of out of oral storytelling, and there I got also the confidence that I could actually speak to scientists or students in environmental studies, and that I could actually contribute something, because nobody needs the data. I could easily make a book that contains all the information about global warming, but that's not really what we need, because and I get very bored when I read a book like that, because I already know the glaciers are melting. I know the ice cap is going. I know the shift of the migration to the north because of. I know the forest fires and that. I know all the data, but the idea is you have to filter it through culture, and you have to filter it through personal stories, mythology, put it into new context. So I was very proud when maybe a scientist that had a PhD in glaciology would tell me that I was actually contributing to his own understanding of what he was doing. And also because the glacial scientist can be so focused on his issue that he hasn't been thinking of the ocean. So when he starts to think of himself in context with the ocean and then his grandmother, I got this confidence that yes, you always ask yourself as an artist, why am I stepping into this field? Do I have a contribution? And I felt, yes. So when I see a person with a PhD and he says, this book spoke to me, I feel, okay, I am doing something good. I am making some sense here. So so I was telling these stories, but the book just didn't happen. I could have a 1-hour speech, I could have a 2-hour speech, and I could tell all the stories, I could show all the data, but then the book just didn't happen. So then I thought, okay, I'm getting a bit impatient here, and this thing needs to go further and wider, and the book isn't happening quick enough because it just didn't make sense. How can I put my grandmother, ocean acidification, the Dalai Lama, the frozen cow of Nordic mythology? How can I put all this together in a book? It just wasn't fitting. So I decided to run for president instead, and because I had all the data, I could tell the stories orally. So I thought, okay, I'll just run for president, and then I can just tell people what is happening, and they don't need to have the book first. I can just and I can maybe just make these things happen. Of course, I don't have real power as an Icelandic president, but I could influence things to happen quicker. This was before Greta Thunberg came out. So I thought, if Iceland is representing anything internationally, and if I am able to speak to 1,000 people, and I know from the feedback, I had met all the mayors of the Nordic countries, so I knew I could speak to people in high ranks. So if I can do that, okay, I'll just run for president, and then I can call Britney Spears and ask her to meet this scientist and talk about the issue and make things happen, kind of escalate the change, because no nation on earth has, or few nations on earth has as much to do with ocean as Iceland. So if we have a president, he should represent the oceans. And at the time, the oceans were totally neglected, like in international talks. It was all about land, forests, glaciers, ice caps. Oceans was not a big thing. And they were actually hoping the oceans would take more carbon, because that would prevent global warming. That was a talk in around 2010, 12. Hopefully the oceans will take up more carbon, because that will buffer the global warming. So ocean acidification was like a secondary thing. So yes, let's let the oceans die, because it will give us 20 more years of pumping carbon into the earth. So I ran for president, but that didn't work. And then I also had kind of an activist burnout from doing that. And so I had to finish one more book. So I made a book of very personal short stories, without any ideas, without any agenda, just like very raw short stories about love and memories and relationships and some down-to-earth stories, but also and then I had done a children's book, which is a wild fantasy, and I had done down-to-earth, totally non-activist, intimate book about friendship and relationships and life. And then the crop cycle was ripe for just diving deeply into this. But at the same time, that was in 2016, when that book came out. And then I got a phone call and I was asked by an Icelandic singer if I wanted to come with him to Kathmandu to record a mental health awareness concert next week. So it was like with a week's notice if I wanted to come with him to Kathmandu. And I said, of course, because I was both very interested in mental health, and he's an excellent singer. He's one of our biggest talents in music. His name is Högni. And I needed to see the Himalayas because I had never really seen the Himalayas, and I didn't feel like I could, where the holy cow lives, the frozen cow that feeds most of Asia. So I really needed to go to the Himalayas. And that came like with a week's notice. So suddenly I was in the Himalayas. I could really feel what I was talking about. I could see the people that were living by these rivers that are coming from these glaciers. I could meet the crocodiles in the rivers. And suddenly everything started to come together. Of course, these rivers have, because people said, you can't write a book about mythology, global warming, your grandmother, the Dalai Lama, ocean acidification. So I said, I'm also going to write about my uncle that was a savior of crocodiles. He was the greatest crocodile expert maybe on the planet. So in the river that was running from the frozen glaciers, I saw the crocodiles, and then everything started to come together. Yes, of course, it all makes sense. Even the holy cow is the mother, the frozen cow is also the mother of crocodiles and people, and everything hangs together in a delicate, connected web. And there, the story kind of started to build up, like from personal memories of me having the opportunity to visit my uncle to help him research crocodiles in the Amazon. But I did not go on that trip. I always regretted that. But instead, I was working in the institute, working on the ancient manuscripts of the poetic Edda. So from crocodiles and ancient Edda, I could kind of step slowly into the story.
Wonderful. Yeah. The book.
That was a long answer.
Yes. No problem. The book will be or is almost translated into 30 languages.
Yeah.
We have some of the book titles here. I had German one here. We have the Icelandic here.
Danish here.
Danish.
Swedish here. This is the Nordic house, so it's English here.
English. Yeah.
And it's translated to Korean, and it's doing very well in Italy.
This was what I would like to ask next. Is there any specific country that is more into it than others? And is there a country, for example, where it doesn't sell at all, or where people aren't interested at all? Is there any extremes? Or?
Yeah, it's interesting. You have the same book, and you have many countries, and it's doing very well in Sweden. I wasn't very optimistic for Sweden because they are so advanced. You know, they have Greta. Why would they need me? so I didn't think Sweden would respond to it, but it's doing very well in Sweden, and Poland very well. So I just see it like from I'm actually not from statistics, just from feedback or from my Instagram or what I see on Twitter. So Poland, Sweden, and Italy is doing very well. So I won a prize in Italy, the Tiziano Terzini Award for the book, which award for the best foreign book in Italy, or yeah, and I think it also has something to do with maybe what approach. It's doing fine in Germany as well. I think it's based a bit on the approach, maybe from the publisher, because I understand that you don't want to buy a book that tells you the glaciers are melting. You know, why should I buy a book to tell me that? And so my book is about global warming, but it's still not about global warming. It's more about our cognition, it's about memories, it's about being an individual. It's my personal story. So the idea was that the issue is like a black hole. That is, you can't really look straight into the black hole because it draws in all light. But you can understand the black hole by looking at the periphery. So how do you talk about time? You can talk about time in many ways, but I use my grandmother as a timeline because she's almost 100 years old. And how can I talk about the future? That hasn't happened. But maybe I can connect to the future by connecting to the past and understanding that people will connect to me in the same way in the future. And so Italy is doing very well. It's strange, but it almost doesn't Google in Denmark. I'm not sure why. It's just I haven't had a single interview in Denmark. But I was almost full-time answering interviews in Italy, like for a month or something, like constantly in the big papers there. So, but yeah, I'm. It's just a privilege, of course, to be able to write in Icelandic, which is a marginal, tiny language, and of course, thanks to my translators that enable me. And I also really love because I learned very quickly that translators like difficult things. So you would think when you're writing a book and you want to speak to the world, that you would not talk about your grandmother. You would not have place names that are difficult to pronounce. You would not talk about quirky things. You would try to be very international.
We have some questions from the audience. So they are asking if you are touring also in Germany.
I will go to Germany in November, I think.
In November.
Yeah, okay, I think in November or in either late October or November. I'm going to Hamburg, and I will probably try to. They can mail me if they have venues or places to visit. I will probably try to take a week in Germany in November or late October.
Yeah. And then there is a question which I would have also asked you. So when I read your book, it was a lot about facts about warming, global warming, about very negative facts, and at some points it is very heavy also to take as a reader, and then in the end it turns. And so the question is, what from the audience is, what is the hope? What is your hope? And this is at least also the end of when the book turned to the end.
Yeah.
You're writing a lot about hope and yeah, what to expect in the future if we are able to switch our behavior and also use some modern technologies.
Yeah, so that was a difficult thing also, because when you dive so deeply into this, you actually get sometimes hopeless because it's overwhelming, and you just think, okay, maybe we're just like so like the combined intellect of us humans, the combined engineering excellence, political science, universities, infrastructure, laboratories, the combined excellence of humans is the outcome of that excellence as intelligent as an algae bloom. There is an algae bloom that just grows into the resource it has, like you can see in lakes when an algae bloom happens. All of a sudden the lake becomes green, and then it finishes all the oxygen, and everything dies until a few algae are left to make another algae bloom some years later. So is our combined intellect eventually as wise as the most simple organisms on the planet, or are we able to observe, react, adapt, and fix what we see is happening, or are we just designed to hit the wall and die, or by maybe a few billion of us, and then we will regrow into something else? I don't want to think that. Of course, that's an option of doing that we will have we will just hit the wall, and we will just face the consequences, and then we will adapt to that. But we will look back at this period of humanity as some kind of a golden age, or the wrong golden age. I'm not sure. So I had to find some kind of hope, and also wonder, is it possible to react in 30 years? And I looked at the 20th century, and it's actually amazing what has happened in 30 years. That is from just understanding how an object can glide, until they had a motorized airplane, until they were crossing the Atlantic, until they had reached the moon. So crossing the Atlantic, and then 30 years later they were at the moon. So of course, from the theory of the neutron to a fully exploded bomb, just from a theory without finding the neutron, just a theory if the neutron exists, to the nuclear bomb was like 12 years. From somebody telling me that in the future there will be something called a cell phone, and 30 years later I'm casually Facebooking somebody abroad. So we have seen that if we put resources, intelligence, and focus on things can change quite quickly. So what I think, if I would give the most optimistic take on it, of what is going to happen, and of course it has to be science-based, because I can't just have hope that something will happen. So the hope would be based on, yes, we have all the technology. Do we have the political capacity to adapt? If you look at states in America who's still Republican 100 years after slavery or something, you can be pessimistic. But if you look at so politically, of course, we can do it. It is possible. We've seen women's rights. We've seen all sorts of movements that have changed in 30 years. We have the technology already. And if you're optimistic that when suddenly we have the technology already in terms of solar, wind, and then possible thermal technology, all sorts of technology that has not yet been installed properly, because it hasn't been kind of forced upon us, like a 2-week quarantine. So we have the technology, and then I think the shift will happen very quickly, because I think one of the fundamental cultural problems is that we are the ruling generation now. So the prime ministers of the world are our age or 10 years older around, and the business leaders are our age. And I think all of us think that 1970 was 30 years ago. if I asked my friends, do you agree that 1970 was 30 years ago? They said, of course. I said, think again. It was 50 years ago, half a century ago. And if you ask a 20-year-old, what do you feel about 1970? That's like, that's like when somebody was asking me about the Second World War when I was 20. Like it's like black and white. It's so far away. It's just I can hardly imagine how it was to live there. So I think that because we were so focused on the year 2000 that in a strange way, the 2000 was like tattooed in our mind, and we were so focused on thinking of the future as 2000 that we never were able to think beyond 2000. So when somebody says 2070 or 2050, we still feel like that's in 50 years, but it's actually after 30 years, and it's coming closer and closer. So I think in a very strange way, we are disconnected to the 20th century, and we just still live in the 21st century. And we're just like my great-grandmother. It was so obvious that she belonged to the 19th century. It was just everything she did, everything she ate, everything she liked, all her ideas were so obviously 19th century ideas. And we pretend that we are modern and that we can use this and all that, but we are 20th century. We are just, and it just can't be taken away from us. But now the universities are full of students that are born 2000. They're finishing the universities, people that are born 2000. The universities are filling with people born maybe 2003. So this generation is paying into pension funds for their first jobs, and they're expecting to get money from these pension funds in the year 2070. And they're not even old people then. They should be expecting to play golf and play with their grandchildren. So 2070, they're actually putting money into an account to get that money to live for 20 years after they become 70. So they are connected already to 2070, financially. So this generation, so when they pay into this pension fund and they talk to a 60-year-old and they ask this 60-year-old, does this pension fund has oil assets? The 60-year-old says, of course, we're getting this money every year. But for the 60-year-old, it's totally rational to have oil assets because it's a big part of the revenue of the pension fund. But for the 20-year-old, it's the biggest fuck you could ever give a person, because either this oil company has to be bankrupt by 2070, or this oil company will have cooked the planet from beneath his feet. So the difference of generations is huge. So the 20-year-old already of today already sacrificed his or her best years of high school, skipped school dances, did not go to parties, concerts, did not have a graduation party. Just this generation sacrificed the prime of their years for the older generation. This generation also went through the Me Too movement, where the young people set the rules for the older. So it's not the 60-year-old men that define the culture of a workplace. It's the 20, 30-year-old woman that says, this joke is appropriate and this is not. This behavior is appropriate and this is not. So the younger set the rules for the older, and if the older don't behave, they are cancelled. They just lose their job, they lose their company. So this generation is quite ruthless. And when the 60-year-old, after a few years, when they mature and they finish their university degrees, says that I want to continue my 20th century lifestyle, the young person will say, I sacrificed my high school years for you. I sacrificed the dances. I didn't hug my grandmother. I didn't go to school for a year. Now you do something for me, or else you will be cancelled. Because I think this generation will be, both because of language, both because they're born into the climate crisis. And that's just the evolution of paradigm shifts, is that if you're born when the idea is already saturated, it sits differently in you than it does if you get to know the idea when you're 40 or 30. And they are already seeing the fires. They're already seeing the consequences. So my hope is, or my prediction is that first nothing is happening. Like we feel like Greta Thunberg is just screaming, listen to us. I want you to panic. But then suddenly the paradigm shift happens, and then things start happening more quickly than we would have expected. So that's my hope. And it might happen in a way that we don't feel comfortable with, because it might be more radical than even we wanted to have it. And because this generation went through the corona crisis, went through the crazy regime of restrictions and etc., I think they might be quite ruthless when it comes to slashing industries that are most harmful. They won't have any sympathy for that, because they will have seen that all culture was killed for 2 years, all schools, all tourism was killed for 2 years. They'll just say this is just what has to happen because this is the reality. So that's how I think it will happen. So, and then of course the solutions exist, and all the talent, I think, of a whole generation will go into solutions, while our generation went into Facebook and making Twitter and stuff. I think, and that was the sexy thing of my generation. But I think all of the great minds of this generation will feel that their talent is squandered if they don't put their talent into solutions. So when a whole generation puts their talent into solutions, things will start flipping. Then the tide has changed, then the gravity then the ball starts rolling by itself into the right direction. So I'm actually optimistic, not eventually that it will be, so we might be cancelled. People would go through our Instagram account and look at our lifestyle or something. That could happen. Some kind of like in the Cultural Revolution in China, where a young generation just basically revolutionizes against the older generation. That could happen, but of course I hope it will happen in harmony and in peace. But and I'm not saying that, and all sorts of things can happen. So, for example, we have here in Iceland the first facilities that are capturing carbon. So direct air capture, 4,000 tons a year. And when you have built a big factory that is capturing 4,000 tons a year with great effort and science, it becomes totally absurd that we still have chimneys in Europe that are just letting out carbon, like with the concentration of 100%. So we're building a facility here to capture 4,000 tons per year, but there's a 1 million ton chimney in Europe. So as soon as this has been built, they will put a cap on the chimney because that's easier and more cost effective. But also this direct air capture needs to continue because there are like 1,000 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere that needs to be captured and stored. And we also have the technology here in Iceland where they make bubble water, soda water out of CO2, pump it into basalt, and there it creates calcium carbonate. So it's just stored forever as a mineral. And that, so we have here maybe it's a 1% solution, but if we get like or 0.1% solution, but if we get 1,000 of them, then slowly we might have the real solution. But I'm not saying that this will happen without, but I'm sure that we have already triggered lots of suffering. That is because for the next 10, 20, 30 years, while things are being fixed, the consequences are coming out, the rising sea level, the glacial outbreaks in the Himalayas, the droughts, the floods, the fires. So I'm not optimistic, so I just know that lots of things are going to happen. But I want to be optimistic in the long term that people will look back at our time And we will really regret that we didn't start, doing this in the year 2000 full force, because also for the generation of the talent that goes into the solutions, they will feel so much reward in their work because there's so much low-hanging fruit. There's so much progress that can be done in agriculture, in industry, in transportation. There's so much progress that can be instantly, instantly claimed. And when you see people that are working in that field, there's so much meaning. If you go into waste management, you see somebody with sparks in his eyes or her eyes, like, while 20 years ago, I'm in waste management, like a really boring thing, but like I'm in waste management, and they're like so enthusiastic about what they're doing because they really feel progress year by year and that they're actually doing good. A long answer again.
Yeah. When we met weeks before, you were telling me about a film project, a new film project. So this would be my last question. Would you like to tell a little bit about that?
Yes. So I did the film The Third Pole, which is with my co-director Anni Ólafsdóttir, which is a bipolar musical documentary with elephants, and you can see that on iTunes. Actually, it's on some platforms now. And then I did, when the premiere was cancelled because of something. The premiere was supposed to be in March 2020, but it was cancelled. And then we went out with a camera to capture the moment of global stillness when the world stopped. And it's called Apocalypse, kind of a wordplay on apocalypse, so the great pause. And that film will be premiered on the platform of Emergence magazine, which is a US-based magazine.
Okay.
And it's a 52-minute documentary, like a full length. And because everything was on hold, we called the film rental company, where normally the cameras would be occupied in Hollywood productions or big TV series. And we said, okay, is anybody out there capturing what is happening? So everything was on hold. And we said, would you lend us your most expensive camera, your best camera, and your best lenses, and we will go out hunting. And we're quite sure we will find something, or otherwise we'll just send the material to the National Museum just to preserve it. And we found lots of interesting things. So that's a full-blown documentary. And first, The Void was quite kind of boring. There's empty streets, and you can't really watch them for a long time. So we got artists that had lost their traditional spaces to fill the empty spaces. So we have a dancer dancing her way through the airport into the runway where the intersection is. And so very grand scenes that we could capture because nobody was occupying the spaces.
Nice. I think we will put the link in our channels,
Yeah.
so that people are able to find it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any questions, or do you want to tell something to the people?
I think I already spoken.
So okay. Yeah. So thank you very much for telling us about your book, about your ideas, about all the fantastic stories you have in mind around that book. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And yeah, we would like to have you probably again in Germany.
Yeah.
Probably that's possible. And we will try to put as many links in our channel as possible.
Okay, super.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Tack för det.